continuing our study of the Seminar of Jacques Lacan, Book 1, Freud's Papers on Technique, 1953 to 1954. This time we're looking at two chapters, Chapter 11 and Chapter 12, because neither is straightforwardly helpful on its own, probably not even too helpful when paired together. Chapter 11, Ego Ideal and Ideal Ego, is a ramble on a few different fronts. We've got psychoanalyst Charles Leclerc tasked with explicating Freud's paper on narcissism, but he fails so terribly on the assignment he makes excuses for why it's impossible to give a précis of the essay. And when he does make points about the work, he gets several things wrong. In addition to Leclerc's poor explication, we've got Lacan's interruptions, which mostly come off as talking to Leclerc and not to the audience. And then there's our beloved Dr. Manoni, who asks questions for clarification. As we've already seen with Dr. Manoni, this has been his function so far. The whole session is a mess, frankly, and the audience isn't left any the clearer about Freud's paper on narcissism or on the concepts that are supposed to be the subject of this session, namely the distinction between the ego ideal and ideal ego. About the only perspicuous statement in the whole lesson comes at the end, and it's from Lacan. This is Lacan's definition of love, and this is on page 142. Here Lacan says, quote, "It's one's own ego that one loves in love, one's own ego made real on the imaginary level." Now, that's a pretty confusing idea, but it seems to be that love, according to Lacan, is a kind of narcissism, a love of one's own ego in fantasy form. And note that Lacan just states this ex cathedra, or rather, sorry, I should pronounce this correctly, ex cathedra, without reasons for believing this to be true. Again, this chapter is a bad chapter all around. So let's go ahead and move to chapter 12. And I cannot pronounce the title of this chapter well. It is two German words in conjunction, and I believe it's pronounced Zeitliche Entwicklungsgeschichte. I can't do any better than that. Chapter 12 is mostly a discussion between Lacan and the students, and here we have one of Lacan's greatest hits, when he says on page 146, quote, "Man's desire is the desire of the other." According to Lacan, so many of our desires are imposed from without, and it takes a lot of sorting on our part, or on the therapist's part, to separate what we want from what authority figures want or what we think they want for us. Let's move on. Lacan finally gets around to providing some clarity on the difference between the ego ideal and ideal ego in this chapter. The ego ideal may be built up from expectations we have for ourselves or we imagine others to have for us, where the ideal ego is what we recognize or misrecognize, to say it better, when we comprehend ourselves in the mirror stage. We think we see ourselves as a totality at some point in our development, and the recognition of ourselves as the other sees us gives us what Lacan calls a feeling of, quote, ideal mastery over ourselves. And he says that on page 148. This feeling of ideal mastery is what Lacan means by the ideal ego. What the ideal ego leaves out is the true nature of a person's desire. There's the imagined self-mastery, but when the subject wants to know what he or she truly wants, when the subject goes seeking for that, he or she finds, Lacan says, when he or she looks to the other, only, quote, a series of ambivalent planes of alienations of his desire, of a desire still in pieces, end quote. And that quote is found on page 148 also. Then we have some more comments on love on page 149. Psychoanalyst Jean Hippolyte remarks that a man in love, through the act of love, with, quote, the other, he wants his own death, end quote. And Lacan agrees. In fact, he says, we are all completely agreed that love is a form of suicide. That quote is on page 149. Again, these remarks are made ex cathedra without further clarification. Some final helpful comments come when Lacan riffs on the importance of the symbolic order to the human being. Lacan says, if we skip to page 155, if one has to define the moment at which man becomes human, we can say it's the moment when, however little it be, he enters into the symbolic relation, end quote. It is through the symbolic relation that we can have anything like an access to the unconscious at all and make peace with that part of ourselves. The unconscious is, Lacan says on page 158, quote, something negative, something ideally inaccessible, but at the same time, it is something which will be realized in the symbolic, or more precisely, something which, thanks to the symbolic, progress takes place in analysis, end quote. Rendering the unconscious into the symbolic order, that is, into language, into what Lacan is calling in this era full speech, is part of the goal of psychoanalysis and reveals those unconscious processes that had been guiding the subject all along. That's enough scattershot material for one lesson. We'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you for listening.